Hello and welcome to the editorial analysis of the Hindu. Today we shall be discussing the editorial of the 4th of March. So coming to the first article, the basics are vital. Now the opinion here is that making hospitalization affordable will spell relief, but there is no alternative to strengthening primary health care. Now this is an important article because healthcare as such is a very important topic for UPSC. Even essays specifically on healthcare is what have been asked in the past. So this topic is a UPSC favorite, and as a result of that it becomes important. So the context is the importance of primary health care. Now for those of you who do not understand the meaning between primary, secondary and tertiary health care, now here is a small example of this, that it is a chain that the government follows, or for that matter the Indian healthcare system follows. What happens at the primary level is that a basic healthcare treatment is what is given. Here medicines is what are given to the patients. A diagnosis and preventive type of healthcare is what is given at the primary healthcare level. Then is the secondary healthcare, where some serious patients who are diagnosed with some serious illness, they go to the secondary level, and the most serious and critically ill patients go to the tertiary level. So both secondary and tertiary healthcare is what requires hospitalization, whereas it is the primary healthcare which includes largely the OPD aspect of healthcare, which is the outpatient departments. So that is the basics of the primary, secondary and tertiary healthcare. Now coming to the issues which have been discussed. Now the first issue is with regards to some data. Here some government reports are what have been quoted. Now the editorial says that a high level expert group on universal health coverage is what was formed, and this group noted that 70% of government health spending should go to primary health care. Another thing that has been mentioned here is with regards to the National Health Policy of 2017. Now, as per this policy also, it was suggested that 2/3 of the expenditure of the government, of the entire expenditure that the government is doing on health, should be on primary health care. So here the editorial is saying that it is government reports themselves which have highlighted that primary health care is the most important part of healthcare in the entire setup or entire chain of health services. So that is one important analysis. Next, which is what has been discussed here, is with regards to the importance of primary health care. Now, primary health care is important because it ensures highest possible level of good health and well-being. Now, it is largely so because it is primary healthcare which ensures a preventive as well as a promotive healthcare orientation. So not only it prevents some diseases from taking place, it promotes good and healthy habits among citizens, and it is also the most accessible healthcare because primary healthcare center is going to be the nearest healthcare center in rural areas. That is what is the importance of primary healthcare. Next, what has been discussed here is with regards to the health and wellness centers. Now, this was a concept that came in the year 2016. This was under the Ayushman Bharat program of the government of India. Now, what was discussed under this particular program was that it is the goal of the government to ensure that approximately 1.5 lakh sub-health centers. Now, under the PHC, if there's a tertiary hospital, then there is a secondary health center, then there is a primary health center. Under this primary health center, we have some sub-health centers. So, the government has envisaged that these sub-health centers, approximately 1.5 lakh of sub-health centers, will be converted into something called health and wellness centers by the year 2022. So, that is the entire aim. Now, some budgetary analysis is what has been given. Now, according to the editorial, an approximate budget of 16 lakh per sub-health center is what is going to be required to convert this into a health and wellness center. So this budgetary requirement is a huge budget that is required, and this budget is at present not provided by the government. So the editorial is questioning this particular goal of the government, that will it be able to reach this goal of 1.5 lakh health and wellness centers by the year 2022, and a budgetary deficit in that regard is what has been highlighted. Next, what has been discussed here is the National Health Mission. Now, the editorial says that the National Health Mission was India's flagship program for primary health care. And what is important is that in this particular mission, the entire focus was largely on providing services related to primary health care, and its share in the health budget was 73% in the year 2006. This is what has reduced to only 50% by the year 2019. So this is going against the idea of strengthening primary healthcare in India, and that is what has been analyzed. Next, what has been analyzed here is with regards to the Pradhan Mantri Jan Aushadhi Yojana. This is also known as the Ayushman Bharat program. Now, this is an insurance program which aims to cover approximately 10 crore poor families for hospitalization expenses up to the tune of rupees 5 lakh. So, this is something about this particular scheme. Now, if it is providing this insurance cover for hospitalization, so focus of the scheme is as obvious on secondary and tertiary healthcare and not on primary healthcare, and that is what has been analyzed here. Now, what the entire analysis is that this is a novel scheme and this is something that India warrants. Health insurance is something that India is lacking and it is very much required for the poor. But this does not mean that what should be ignored at the cost of this is primary healthcare. That is going to be a cause of concern. A balance is what is needed to be drawn both between primary as well as secondary and tertiary healthcare, and that is what has been analyzed vis-a-vis this scheme. Next, what has been analyzed is the issue of privatization of health sector. Now, you should know that in India, India is one country which has highest privatization of health sector. And not only that, the government is further encouraging privatization of health sector. This can be seen through several schemes of the government where government is giving some incentives to private sectors to open hospitals in tier 2 and tier 3 cities. That is what has been analyzed. But the issue is that for private health sector, for privatization of health sector, what is more profitable is the secondary and tertiary healthcare rather than a primary healthcare. So it will not be in the interest of the private sector to open primary health centers, and it is this vacuum that is going to be created, which the government only will have to come and plug. That is what has been analyzed. Also, private sector is time again criticized for focusing only on cities, and rural areas are what I ignored. So a huge divide is what exists between rural and urban India vis-a-vis healthcare, and that is what has been analyzed here. Next, what has been discussed is with regards to the plight of primary health centers in India. Now, the plight is something that is deplorable. First and foremost, what has been criticized is that there is already a shortage of primary health centers as well as the secondary health centers and sub-health centers. They are already very less in India. Also, only 7% of the sub-health centers and 12% of the primary health centers meet public health standards. There are poor infrastructures in these buildings. Also, there are basic facilities which are lacking. For example, drinking water is what is not available. Toilets are what are not available. Electricity is not available. There is shortage of staff. So, the plight of already existing health centers is also something that is deplorable, and the government needs to focus on that, improve the conditions of the PHCs. Next, what has been analyzed is the out-of-pocket expenditure, and now here the editorial is giving a novel idea. Now, out-of-pocket expenditure is something that is very, very high in India. Hospitalization costs are very high. So, the editorial is discussing that if India has a health structure where the primary health centers are strong, then what happens is that this prevents a lot of diseases. It is preventive, and this is what is going to result in decreased hospitalization. So, if a disease is diagnosed at an early stage, then definitely the cost of its treatment is going to get reduced, and this is what is going to reduce the out-of-pocket expenditure, and that is the importance, and that is how it has been linked to primary health center. So that is one analysis. Next, what has been discussed is with regards to the government commitments. Now here, the editorial discusses that the government has time and again shown its commitment towards health, be it any government. They have promised health assurance to all. They have promised a healthy India of vision in the vision document of 2030. So if these are the commitments that the government is given, then definitely the government should get more serious about health, and it should focus on the bedrock of health, which is primary health care, and that is the entire analysis. So this editorial not only gives us good ideas about health itself, but is largely biased in the favor of primary health care, which is also a real analysis. It is an important one, and this is something we should replicate in our answers also. So that's going to be the relevance. Coming to the next article, the week after. Now this is context with regards to the Indo-Pakistan tensions which are still continuing. Now the week after is, why it's called the week after is because this is after 1 week of the Balakot air strikes which India has conducted on Pakistan. So in the aftermath of that, some developments are what have taken place, and those are what have been discussed in the editorial. So coming to the issues, the first issue is with regards to some diplomatic maneuvers. Now, in the aftermath of Indian air strikes, what has happened is that there are some tendencies of de-escalation of tensions. So definitely a military stand-up is something that is not going to happen for long. So what is being suggested here is that in that light, there is more scope for diplomacy, and the government should now focus on more diplomatic maneuvers with Pakistan and also in the international community. That is something that has been highlighted. Also, what has been appreciated here are the efforts that Indian diplomacy has played in the international sphere. You should know that these airstrikes are something that have not been criticized by any country. Also, India has achieved diplomatic advantages in the OIC, which is the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, as well as in the UNSC, which has criticized the Pulwama attack. So this is something that has been analyzed vis-a-vis diplomatic maneuvers. Next, what has been discussed in the editorial is with regards to Masood Azhar. Now, in the past, India has tried time and again attempted to give him the status of an international terrorist, but this is something that has not happened. But what has now happened is that another listing request is what has been issued or what has been filed in the UNSC. This is something that has been done by US, UK and France. These are the countries that are supporting the labeling of Masood Azhar and Jaish-e-Mohammed as an international terrorist organization. And it is expected that this time probably China is the one who has always been objected to this title on this particular organization, but it is being expected that China this time might not be able to object. So that is something that is new here. Next, what is important is the role of international community. Now, you should know that the international community has not been absolutely silent on the India-Pakistan standoff. It was suggested that Pakistan had returned Indian Air Force officer only on insinuations from foreign countries, because the same was something that was signaled by the US President in Hanoi long before the Pakistan government officially declared the same. So there has been a role of international community, and it is expected that this role is going to continue in future also. So India will also have to be wary of the fact that the international community is watching India and Pakistan. So that is something that has been analyzed. Next, what has been discussed here is with regards to some strategic gains. Now, the editorial says that in the aftermath of this standoff, what is important is that India analyzes that whether or not it has had any strategic gains out of this standoff. At present, there is lack of clarity on this because India still does not know the strength of Jaish-e-Mohammed, and it still does not know that what has been the damage caused to Jaish-e-Mohammed, and also Pakistan has been reluctant in giving any commitments. So strategic gain is something that has not happened. Also, the new military normal which India wanted to establish with Pakistan is something that Pakistan has curbed, and that is also something that has not happened. So what is important here as a gain is that India cracks down on the Jaish-e-Mohammed links in Jammu and Kashmir and set things right in its own country. So that can be one gain, that can be one lesson that India learns in the aftermath of Pulwama. Next, what has been discussed here is with regards to the claims and counter-claim spiral that India and Pakistan are stuck in. Now, this is a key word also, that is why I have mentioned it. Now, this is no secret that India and Pakistan are claiming versus counter-claiming success for themselves, and this is something that is spiraling high. So this is one analysis that this is a wrong precedence, and this is something that should not happen between countries. Rather, peace is what both countries should move towards. A better diplomatic relations, beginning of negotiations is what both these countries should suggest. What has been suggested for both these countries. So that is the entire analysis vis-a-vis this particular article. We are discussing many articles on India, Pakistan. It has become very, very important. So it is also important that we keep discussing some updates that are happening, and it is in that regard that I have discussed this particular editorial. So that is the relevance. Coming to the next article, deepening slowdown. Now, the context here is with regards to a slowdown in the Indian economy. This has happened in the this is a 7-quarter low for the Indian economy. So this is something that becomes important for us. Now, the data is something that is very subjective and it keeps changing. So you need not focus much on the data, but some trends is what becomes vital. First and foremost, coming to the CSO data. Now here, the Central Statistical Office has said that the GDP growth estimates are 6.6% for the quarter of October to December period. And the full year forecast is something that is now at 7%. So this is what are the figures given by the CSO. Now the reasons are what are important for us. The first reason is the agriculture sector. Now the gross value added growth in the agriculture sector is what has reduced to 2.7% from 4.2%. Now, for those of you who are having difficulty in understanding these terms like GVA and growth rate, please refer to our 2-minute series on economy. I have discussed all these terms in detail, so they can help. help you understand them better. Next, what is important here is vis-a-vis the agriculture sector is that there has been a deficient northeast monsoon. Now, northeast monsoon is the retreating monsoon. Now, if this monsoon is what is deficient, then it impacts the sowing of the rabi crops, which are the winter crops, and that is something that has been happened in the agriculture sector, and that is what has been attributed to the slowdown. So, and once the agriculture sector faces a slowdown, the entire rural economy gets impacted, and as a result of that, there is a slowdown. So that is what has been analyzed. Next, vis-a-vis manufacturing sector, also some flaws in the manufacturing sector, some slowdown in the manufacturing sector is what has been discussed. Now, as per the editorial, the manufacturing sector has shown a growth of 6.7% compared to the 6.9% previously in the last quarter. Also, the index of industrial production, which shows the growth of the manufacturing sector, is showing a slowdown from 8.7% to 2.7%. So again, it is the manufacturing sector and agriculture sector. Whenever otherwise also in general you have to make a guess that what is the cause of slowdown, then these are the most vulnerable sector in Indian economy, and it is largely attributed to these two sectors only. So that is what is important. Next, what is important is that the RBI has initiated a rate cut. Now, once the RBI has cut its rate, what is going to happen is that interests are going to get reduced. So definitely loans are going to become cheaper. So there is going to be more loans that the banks will be able to give out, and as a result of which there will be more money supply, and this might spur some growth in the economy. And this is what is anticipated by the RBI, and in that anticipation, it has cut its rate. So that is what is important here. Next, what has been highlighted here is a period of uncertainty. Now, why is this a period of uncertainty? It is a period of uncertainty because of the military tensions with Pakistan. Then general election is something that is on the horizon for India. Also, there is uncertain global trade and growth horizons are weak. And another thing what is important is that there is little fiscal leeway for India to increase its spending. So in this backdrop, what has happened is that this is a period of immense uncertainty for India, and that is what the editorial is highlighting, and this is one important analysis. You should know that this being important primarily because of the 7-quarter low. Otherwise, such trends are not relevant because they are highly fluctuating. So the article only becomes important from this perspective. Coming to the next article, failing the forest. Now, this is a very, very important article. In fact, it is the most important in today's discussion. The context here is that the Supreme Court has stayed its February 13 order, where it called for the eviction of more than 10 lakh Adivasis and other forest dwellers from forests across 17 states, and it was largely because these people could not prove their claim under the Forest Right Act of 2006. We have been discussing several articles on this issue in the past, but this editorial brings out some newer points, so that is why it is important. Now, first, what is important is, we had discussed previously also, that it is important that the states relook into their own decisions. So now the Supreme Court is going to take this relook into the decisions of the state. Now, you should know that it is the Gram Sabha that first raises the case as to whether or not a person is eligible for getting forest rights under this act. Then once the Gram Sabha gives the names, then what happens is that there is a screening committee of 6 members that decides whether or not a person is to be given these rights. First and foremost, the screening committee is at the subdivision level, and next the screening committee is at the district level. So the state has a major role to play here. Of these 6 members, 3 members are official and 3 members are elected. So that is the entire chain or hierarchy through which these rights are what are approved. But because 10 lakh people could not prove their rights, then as a result of that, what became important was to analyze that whether the states have rightfully not given them the right under FRA, or has the state made some mistakes? Because the Zaza committee, as we had discussed in the past, had highlighted that the state is not responsible in giving these rights, and the state has made some errors. For instance, some areas, some lands are what the state has still not recognized as forest land itself. So it is because of the errors of the state that many people are suffering. So for that reason, the Supreme Court has decided to take a relook into the approvals of the state. So that is something that has been analyzed here. Next, what is an important analysis in this editorial is a binary or a conflict which is existing between the wildlife groups and the human rights group. Now, this is something that is old to this particular act itself. Now, what is happening here is that whenever this act is spoken about, the wildlife right groups always criticize this act. They say that if people are given rights on forest land, then what happens is that wildlife gets damaged. It results in increased man-animal conflict. It results in forest degradation and loss of forest cover. So, all of these issues is what wildlife groups highlight. Whereas similarly, human rights group highlight the fact that since India's independence itself, or rather even before that, India was following a model where the forests were considered as a state property and the state bureaucracy was dealing with forests. And the traditional rights of the Adivasis and people who were living in the forest were always exploited, and this was one of the most vulnerable groups. So they always speak that these rights are something that are justified and they need to be given. So in this backdrop, what happens is that there is always a conflict between these two groups, and this is one important analysis here. This issue, this conflict is something that can also come as a case study in the ethics paper. So there is going to be an importance because both the groups have some positives and some negatives. So these kind of case studies are something that are a UPSC favorite and they tend to ask these kind of questions. Next, what is important is with regards to the protection of forests. Now, the editorial discusses that both the groups have their own positives as well as negatives, but what has happened is that one group is favoring for the protection of wildlife, while the other group is favoring for the protection of the Adivasis. But for both these groups, what is important is the protection of the forest. And in this tussle between these groups, the forest is something that both these groups are not thinking about. And that is what has been analyzed in the editorial, that the forest needs to be protected. And this is something that both the groups must focus collectively upon. Next, what has been discussed in the editorial is with regards to a myth that the wildlife lobby has. Now, what is this myth is that the forest dwellers' right, the wildlife lobby thinks that the forest dwellers' right is something that is not equal to the forest destruction or clear felling that forest. Now, what happens is that wildlife right activists often think that just because a right is what is going to be given to a forest dweller, this will automatically amount to damaging the forest or clearing the forest or lead to deforestation and degradation. Whereas they just do not wish to accept that this is not the case. Just by giving them sustainable rights in this region, it does not amount to destruction of the forest, and that is a real picture which the wildlife lobby and wildlife activists should accept, which is not happening in this particular case. So that is what has been analyzed. Next, what has been discussed here is with regards to the role of the Gram Sabha. Now, as I discussed, the Gram Sabha has a major role to play under the Forest Rights Act, and this empowers the Gram Sabha. Also, an example is what has been given, and these kind of examples are what you should replicate in your answers. They give a good impression. Now, an example of the year 2013 is what has been given. In the case of Vedanta Group, where a $1.7 billion bauxite mining project in Odisha's Niyamgiri Hills was what was rejected by 12 Gram Sabhas under the Forest Rights Act at that point of time. So this act has enabled the Gram Sabhas to take such decision, and this is a positive step. Also in the year 2016, under the Forest Rights Act, the NGT had under this particular act given the right to the Gram Sabha of the people of Lip in Himachal Pradesh. This is a region in Himachal Pradesh. They were given powers to decide whether or not they wanted a hydropower project that was to be developed in that particular area, and this would lead to the submergence of the forest land in that region. So time and again the authorities are invoking this particular act and asking this issue with the Gram Sabha, giving the power to the Gram Sabha to decide on these issues. In this particular case of Vedanta, the Supreme Court had done this, and in the year 2016, the NGT did that. So what is being highlighted here is the importance of this particular act, that this act has been a successful one, and how it has made the decision of the people foremost, and that is what is an important analysis. Next, what has been discussed here is with regards to the conundrum for states. Now, the editorial discusses that it is often said by wildlife group activists that the states are seeking the votes of people. The votes of these Adivasis and other forest dwellers is what the states are seeking, and it is in seeking of these particular votes by these citizens that the states give them these forest rights. But this is something that has been challenged in the editorial. The editorial discusses that states are not only always thinking about votes, because for instance, the development of a project in forest lands, a big project is what is to be developed, suppose in a state, then in that case it becomes very, very difficult for the state to remove the forest occupations, or for that matter forest dwellers. So definitely it is a conundrum for the state, and the state is not biased, so that is one defense of the state that has been given here. Next, what has been discussed here is with regards to the combining of two groups. Now as above also, now again it is being suggested that these two groups, the wildlife rights group as well as the human rights group, they need to join in the collective protection of forests, which is for the interest of both. Not only this, they have to join against the big development projects and private players that are coming in forests and who are leading to clearing of the forest land. So it is against them that these two groups should rise rather than against each other, and that is the important analysis. Next, what has been discussed here is with regards to the inefficient role of the human rights group. Now the editorial is criticizing the human rights group. It is saying that this human rights group only comes for debates and not on the ground. When these people, when these Adivasis were to file for the claims on forest rights, at that point of time, the paperwork that was to be done by them is something that should have been cooperated to by the human rights group, but clearly that has not happened. And it is for this reason that the human rights group is being criticized. And also when this case was being fought in the Supreme Court, the human rights activists showed lesser representation and have not fought the case well. So it is for this reason that they are being criticized. Now this issue is one of the most important issues in my opinion for mains. I am definitely expecting that somewhere in some paper you will find a question on this. Most probably it can be asked in ethics. It can be asked in polity also, in general studies paper 2, because the FRA is what is involved. As a social issue, it becomes important in general studies paper 1 because it is the rights of the scheduled tribes and these vulnerable communities. So it is from all of this context that this topic is very, very important, and that is going to be the relevance of this particular article. Now that's all for today. I thank you all for watching the video.